Hello, everybody, to the Virtual Institute of Public Knowledge at New York University. I'm very excited to have you here. I'm grateful that you are able to join us for another episode of The Shift. Now, I'm in New York City and there is a snowstorm rolling in and the internet has been spotty for those of us who are on the East Coast. So if the internet kind of is spotty, we might go off camera and just be warned that that could happen. Hopefully we'll be okay. Now, today's conversation begins with a question mark. This shift is called the shift shifting forward question mark. And it really sets out to reflect in our lives as they have very much been altered by the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we're really after today is asking, what does it mean to shift forward? My name is Sloane. I am a sociologist at New York University. I work on social inequality and technology. I also wear a few other hats at NYU and at the University of Tübingen in Germany. And I'm a fellow here at IPK. And over the past 2 years already of the COVID-19 pandemic, I've had the pleasure of developing and delivering the Shift series together with IPK's director, Eric Kleinenberg, Eli Pariser of New Public, and a terrific team at IPK. I also want to say a special welcome and a big thank you to the co-sponsors of the series, which are the Knight Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and New Public. Now, before I introduce my distinguished guests and say a few words to frame the conversation tonight, I want to acknowledge that by being in New York City, I'm standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. And I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous communities on whose land you are currently standing, and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. I also want to ask that you join me in thanking all the essential workers. I think that is still important that we do that. Doctors, nurses, teachers, subway conductors, bus drivers, supermarket workers, delivery workers, and so many more, who for almost 2 years have made it possible that our social lives, at least in some way, continued in what is still a global public health emergency. Now, the Shift series is a series here at IPK that we started in the beginning of the pandemic when we all went into our first lockdown, and where we're feeling that so many things were profoundly shifting all around us relating to the pandemic, but not only. The Shift very broadly sets out to explore the social implications of the shifts in public life that we were collectively experiencing since the start of the pandemic and that we're still very much part of. But rather than offering perhaps unsolicited advice, as we were all trying to become experts in this process of shifting, we wanted to open up a space for sharing experiences and asking important questions that we hope we do remember as we rebuild healthier and stronger communities as we slowly resurface. Ultimately, the shift is about getting our head around the question of how can we imagine and materialize a new and more equitable modality of social life as we collectively pass through this portal. We've had quite a few of the shift conversations thus far. Our very first one was on public space, then we had one on education and one on food. And as we are hopefully nearing the phase in which the pandemic fizzles out, and we want to kind of discuss today what this fizzling out could look like, and what this kind of new type of shifting could look like. And we've kind of come to terms with the fact that there's no shifting into the before, but a shifting into a reality that is about adaptability and moving around and getting used to this kind of adaptation to new challenges. The questions we want to ask today are, what will our future look like? What do we need to keep from this time of collective trauma? And to whom or what can we look to find guidance for mapping out our collective and individual paths forward? Now, to help us wrap our heads around these questions, perspectives from psychology, consumer culture, futures and forecasting, and history are extremely important. And we are extremely lucky to have three absolutely fantastic experts with us tonight who are bringing their expertise from these domains to the table. Mindy Fullilove, Devon Powers, and Erica Charters. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Mindy Fullilove is a social psychologist who explores the ties between environment and mental health. She received her bachelor's degree from Brigham Mayer College and her MS and MD degrees from Columbia University. She completed residency at New York Hospital, Westchester Division, and Montefiore, and is board certified in psychiatry. With her colleagues at the city's research group and the University of Orange, Mindy explores the consequences of social fracture for our society and our health and seeks ways to connect the broken parts. Prior to joining the New School full-time in 2016, Mindy taught at Columbia University and was a lecturer at Parsons. She has published over 100 scientific papers and 8 books, including the highly regarded Urban Restoration Trilogy. That is always a little bit intimidating for a young scholar like me. Welcome, Mindy, and thank you for being here. Also joining us today is Devon Powers, who is an associate professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations in the Klein College of Media and Communication at Temple University. Her research focuses on consumer culture, cultural circulation, and the future. She's the author of On Trend, The Business of Forecasting the Future, which was published in 2019, as well as Writing the Record, The Village Voice, and the Birth of Rock Criticism, and the editor of Blowing Up the Brand, Critical Perspectives on Promotional Culture. Her writing has also appeared in numerous academic and popular venues, including Washington Post, The Atlantic, Wired, New Media and Society, and the Journal of Consumer Culture. Welcome, Devon, and thank you so much for being here. And then lastly, joining us from the United Kingdom tonight is Erica Charters, who is a historian of disease, war, and empires. She is professor of the global history of medicine at Oxford University, where she's also director of Oxford Center for the History of Science, Medicine, and Technology, and co-director of Oxford Center for Global History. She has published on the history of colonial medicine, as well as the history of imperial law and its relationship to disease. Her recent publications include a special journal issue on the history of epidemics in the context of COVID-19, and an article on how epidemics end. She is currently coordinating a multidisciplinary project on how epidemics end. Thank you so much for joining us today, Erica, on a Friday evening. And then to help our imagination, we are making use of a fairly traditional tool, but in an unconventional way, the whiteboard. And we are very grateful to have with us tonight the wonderful Jojo Carlin, who is also at NYU and has agreed to live illustrate our conversation. She has been drawing since she was young, but during her graduate studies, she saw new possibilities for using art in her academic notes. Jojo, digital scholarship specialist at NYU Libraries, is interested in ways our impressions of people influence and contribute to our understanding of their ideas. Her visual note-taking is a multimodal process, and instead of writing words exclusively, she draws as she listens, reads, and processes concepts. She won a prize presenting her illustrated dissertations, Yours sincerely, Virginia Woolf, Virginia Woolf's Poetics of Letter Writing, at the 4th Annual Dissertations Showcase on May 19th, 21, and was recently profiled an IFA contemporary. She posts her wonderful work on Twitter under Jojo Carlin and on Instagram also under Jojo Carlin. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Jojo, and we are seeing your work also spotlighted on the screen. Now it is time for me to step back and hand it over to our great panelists. And I want to just do that by opening the conversation with a theme that I think is important and cuts across the work that you do and the expertise that you bring to the table, which is about futures and forecasting and epidemics as uncovering kind of structural parts of society. And so I just maybe want to start with a question for you, Devon. And that's a question about futures as we kind of seeming to cling on to them after 2 years of a pandemic. And so I wonder, maybe you can share your thoughts on what job do futures do in letting us think about public health emergencies? What is their role in thinking about what is, arguably a collective trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I think futures have a couple of different purposes in general. One of those purposes is to give um, shape, if you will, to different kinds of imaginaries, right? So that there are visions and possibilities. Particularly, I think, if you think about the quotidian ways in which the pandemic disrupted people's ability to plan, I think that, like, you can't even plan what you're doing next week or next month, right? So I think that's one kind of important thing. We need to have a concept of tomorrow in order to feel like we kind of have a purpose and a reason for doing the things that we're doing today. But I think you can think about them in a more in a more proactive sense, in the sense of, which is kind of connected to what I said before, which is that putting out new possibilities, possibilities for how things can change, and those possibilities have the potential to create action in the present, right? So, for instance, some future predictions or forecasts exist not so that they're telling you what's going to happen, but rather so that you don't want them to happen. So, for instance, like climate change predictions that are worst case scenarios. We don't want that to happen. We instead want to avert that from happening by lowering emissions and doing other things. So I think those are two ways we can kind of think about that in relationship to public health.
Thank you so much for that, Devon. Mindy, I would love to hear kind of your response to what Devon just said in terms of what work do futures do, specifically with regards to public health and perhaps the context of this particular pandemic.
We were joking before we started that Devon's talking about the future, and then there's conversation about the past, and I'm sort of the present. So I think as a psychiatrist, I'm just obsessed with here we are in this moment where there's a mental health crisis at a scale we've never seen before. And so how do people pass through a crisis where everybody's just a tad crazy? There's anxiety off the chart, there's depression, there's suicidality, there's opioid addiction. And people are on edge, they're very angry with each other or testy because they want the pandemic to be over. That gets to your question mark, right? Shifting forward, question mark. People can't tolerate that uncertainty. So how do they move into a future coming from that? And part of the problem is that the future is so uncertain. We don't know when the pandemic will end. And climate change is bearing down on us. And totalitarian regimes are springing up all over. So there's not a lot to hold on to that makes people feel good. So I think we're moving into a future. It's almost like this is the, Broadway shows open out of town. Like COVID is the Broadway show opening out of town for the big show, which is going to be climate change and all the catastrophes. And who knows what other pandemics. The epidemiologists are very clear. More pandemics are coming because of the ecological disturbances we've made to the earth. So it's a time of great uncertainty, which I think if we were to prepare ourselves and say, okay, this is a time of great uncertainty, how do we handle uncertainty? Then we can move into the future of more uncertainty better. But what are the odds we're going to do that? So Thich Nhat Hanh I'm not sure that you say about a Buddhist, may his soul rest in peace. May his soul be here with us today. Did a book last year called Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet, in which he said with mindfulness is what we got to do. So anyway, that's how I think about the future, that we're in bad shape to go into a hard future.
Thank you for that, Mindy. I want to take that as a cue for you, Erica. And I wonder if there is a comparable situation in the past. And we may not know about, mental health as an additional layer of the pandemic, or an additional pandemic that unfolded alongside a comparable public health emergency in the past. But I wonder how people have dealt with pandemics in the past.
Yeah, I think this point about control and anxiety, and what's really fascinating to me. So, as you said, I'm a historian. I've worked on the history of disease and outbreaks of disease, and especially society's responses to disease for many years, researching it and teaching it. And so it's very odd to have something that I've just read about for many years, then kind of watch it unfolding in my life. But I found that in many ways, history can be a comfort in the midst of this amazing period of uncertainty. And I think one reason that it's a comfort is precisely because history lets us see that many of the things we think of as being novel and uncertain, of course, actually repeat themselves, right? So we can see what epidemics might have in common. Historians often talk about how epidemics are not just about disease per se. They're not just a kind of biological phenomenon, but we should see them as social and political phenomenon, in that it's a period when society sees itself as losing control and being full of unpredictability and this uncertainty. And so this is where you get these feelings of social dislocation. But as a response to that, what we also see is that societies tend to respond in certain ways. There's a kind of one historian, Charles Rosenberg, talks about how there's different stages of responses. And so much of the unfolding of an epidemic is how we humans, we as a collective, try to bring back a sense of order and try to return a sense of control into our lives. And so what I think is interesting is how there's also a notion that this kind of end stage is part of this collective response that we have, this kind of communal ritual that we do. This end stage is when we try to re-envisage the future. And it's part of the process of bringing back together a society that has often fragmented during an outbreak. And so this urge to reimagine a future is really a crucial period when we try to make sense of what's happened, very often when we want a moral interpretation of the epidemic. And so I think endings really are this period of retrospective diagnosis in many ways. Sometimes they involve this period of accusations that could be very divisive, accusations about responsibility and blame. But I think they can also be a period when we're trying to begin a process of reconciliation. And so in some ways, this end stage, when we see it as historians, it's a way in which we see that we're trying to restore human agency into a period in which, for many of us, I think we feel like we've lost a sense of agency, when we've kind of lost our way in terms of our relationship with the natural world. So I think in many ways, it can be a comfort to realize that we're undergoing what's actually been a long-term practice that societies everywhere have undergone.
Thank you for that, Erica. I think my internet is a little bit spotty. I might be back, I hope. I want to take that cue of order and control, and also a kind of moral interpretation of what had happened, that focus on that moral interpretation, to you, Devon. And I wonder, this idea of moral interpretation of the past, does that play a role in how people future or think about the future? And if so, in what way?
I think that's a complicated question because It required sort of thinking about what people we're talking about and what processes of futuring we're talking about. Um, so I guess, as a way in, people have varying understandings of the past, accurate, inaccurate, right? We know we've been talking so much these days about misinformation, and so I think in some ways people can use the past to their own, to fulfill their own ends, right? To sort of suit their own ideologies. In the same way people use biology and like all different kinds of ways of knowing, to kind of suit their purposes. But if I'm talking about, if I can shift the question just a little bit and thinking specifically about how people, so one of the areas of expertise that I have is studying people who study the future and studying people whose job it is to kind of understand and interpret the future. And my sense from that particular group of people is that they have almost no historical sensibility, because there's this sense that the future is just something that's driving forward and that the past is not necessary in order to think about the future, right? The past is actually a hindrance or a burden that keeps us from moving onward. But I think Erica's point about this kind of recursive nature of history and the sense that things happen over and over again, including feeling historically exceptional and including feeling the weight of the future and feeling the impossibility of the future, I think is absolutely instructive and necessary. And like Erica said, in a strange way, a comfort, right? But also an important lesson, just in terms of how, there's just massive amounts of forces that are beyond our control. And even when we get into a place where we feel more secure in the future, I think it's important to retain that sort of, as Mindy was talking about, that comfort level with uncertainty.
Thank you, Devon. I very much appreciate also your nod to Erica's point of like the recursive nature of what we're looking at, and your point about, we kind of tend to ignore the past, right? Which we can problematize in different ways. But I want to, Mindy, I'm so curious to hear, when we look at what is going on and when we look at how the future is talked about in the context of the pandemic, and we look at that through the lens of mental health and a mental health crisis, what landscape does unfold? Is it that we are traumatized from what had happened to us, or that we are terrified of the future, that what had happened to us will happen again, or is accelerated by new crises that as you just pointed out, planetary destruction, new pandemics, and so I'm just curious to hear how you see and assess that.
The assessing is the hard part. I want to speak to Erica's thing about watching pandemics. I happened to start my research career in 1986 with the AIDS pandemic. And one of the first things that happened to me while I was studying AIDS was that people in the San Francisco, Oakland community came and said, by the way, there's a terrible crack epidemic. Could you help us with that? And then there was a terrible violence epidemic associated with the crack epidemic, and the violence epidemic was associated with an epidemic of mental illness, all of mental illnesses related to violence and trauma, etc. And so this, what Roderick Wallace called the synergism of plagues, just the ways in which not only were there this terrible series of epidemics, many of which were also pandemics, but they were interacting with one another. And so the sort of cheerful version, an epidemic ends and you reconstruct the society, is that happens. How can you argue with it? We have historical documentation, but that is not what was happening in American cities in the 80s and 90s and into now. And what was happening in the American city were a lot of assault on social integrity and not enough repair. And you've only to think about repair of New Orleans after Katrina, or repair of Puerto Rico after the more recent hurricanes and disasters. Just not. not fixed. So that means that we've been hit and we've been hit and we've been hit and we haven't been fixed. And now we're being hit massively and not fixed. So at what point do you have a tipping point? And you can't break a society infinitely and say it'll, be resilient, it'll bounce back. So and then if it's one epidemic and it's gonna be over, and there's still coal in the ground and there's still fish in the sea, that's cool, but that's not where we are, right? There's, fish stocks worldwide are vastly depleted. So we've done damage to the ecosystem at a scale that we have not ever done before in history. So history is always new. So even though we look at history for comfort, we're not where that's whatever society we're looking, we're not there. So this is why Thich Nhat Hanh says we are going to have to practice mindfulness, because we're in a place of terrible destruction of human communities, animal communities, plant communities. And, the whole chickens come home to roost. Chickens have come home to roost. So this doesn't mean that we can't get it together, but it means that, what is a tipping point? We're at a tipping point. Your point, shifting forward, we're going to have to shift forward into something new. There is a question mark there, and people don't like question marks. So I don't know if that makes any sense to Devon and Erica, and to you, Mona, and to you, Jojo. But I see us as in very deep crisis.
Thank you, Mindy. Erica, if you don't mind, I want to kind of pass that on to you right away, and maybe hold on to kind of one of the last words that Mindy just said, which is tipping point, and hear your kind of reflection on that notion of a tipping point from a historical point of view, but also from a point of view of somebody who has expertise based on lived experience, because you live now and you are going through this crisis yourself as a member of multiple communities.
I think what Mindy says is really powerful, and I think also I think I was actually thinking a lot about the AIDS epidemic and our experience of epidemics. I was reading this article last night that was talking about how this current epidemic is significant because of the rapidity of its geographical spread, and how rapidly it's being identified in the laboratory, and how this epidemic has been constantly interpreted for us by the media, and how in some ways the American public is watching the epidemic unfold. But this was an article that came out in the 1980s, and it was talking about AIDS. And it really struck me how, to Mindy's point, how, of course, one of the interesting points about epidemics, and when we think about them, is actually how short our memories can be. And so how quickly we can forget certain points. And so what often we're describing as novel might be forgotten. But I also think this broader point that, of course, as Mindy points out, when we talk about an epidemic, it suggests that it's somewhat constrained in time, but actually, of course, not only do epidemics affect different parts of society very differently, but therefore there's many groups in which the epidemic will never end. And of course, actually what we're looking at are overlapping crises. One researcher I was talking to was talking about when COVID arrived and they were working in East Africa, really what they were seeing was one long epidemic. Ebola, HIV, AIDS, cancer, how in many ways these were simply blending into each other for people who were there. Whereas of course we have a sense of a kind of discrete period of crisis. And so I think there's a way in which we can also rethink what we're defining as an epidemic, and therefore what we mean by the notion of something being over, as well as thinking about then what came before and how different that is for people. I suppose it also makes me think, of course, that as a historian, I pretty much avoid trying to predict the future, because I feel like history just ends up showing how problematic it is when people try to predict what's going to happen. But I thought Devon's point about how we use history, right, that it's not just an inert thing that happens to us, but that actually we have the power to think about how we want to interpret it and reinterpret it in the same way that I think this would be the point about this kind of thinking through the next stage, is that, of course, we do have agency. And so this enables us to think, rather than kind of thinking we're simply responding to a crisis being thrust on us, that actually we're constantly making decisions. So again, I think because historians are interested in thinking about humans in the midst of what is otherwise usually described as a kind of biological event, I think part of our point is to get us to realize that we're constantly making decisions, right? An epidemic isn't just something that happens to us. We're constantly making decisions about what our priorities and our values are in terms of how we respond to a biological crisis. So we can still reinterpret, and as Mindy points out, there's still all sorts of options for us in terms of which ways we want to act in response to a crisis.
Can I jump in with something here? Is that okay?
Absolutely. I was going to toss it over to you right away. Go ahead,
Right.
Devon.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is what you wanted or were going to ask me about, but Erica, what you were saying just got me thinking about two different things that I just want to throw out there. The first is that if there's anything that this pandemic has taught me, it's that there is no we, right? Like I almost don't know who you're talking about. That is not, that's not saying anything to you. It's just to say that like the experience of the pandemic has been so radically different in different parts of the world among people who have different kinds of jobs, make different money, different backgrounds, racial, ethnic, etc. And I think that's a really important lesson when we think about all the potential crises that face us going forward and historically, right? That they impact different people differently. And the other lesson it's taught me is that like people don't come together, right? In times of crisis, they don't. Which, depending on who you either are like, well, I'm on the top and therefore I don't have to worry about other people. Or it's like extremely alienating to think that even when humanity is kind of faced with an existential threat, it's still divisive. But maybe, again, that's just a lesson that we can learn from certain understandings of history. I think the other thing that I wanted to throw in here is that when I think about like prediction, I have a very complicated way that I think about prediction and forecasting. And when I think about sort of predicting or forecasting the future, I think it means a couple of different things. I think it means imagination, right? So the idea that what can you imagine, what can you envision? And as I was saying before, like, how can you act in the present in order to try to bring about your visions? And then and then I think it also is about power, right? So certain people or certain, institutions of power that have the possibility and the capacity to set in motion certain activities that then affect a lot more people or potentially everyone. So there are certain groups of people that have those kinds of powers and others that don't. And then it's a little bit, for lack of a better way of putting it, I think that there's an intuitive part to it too, in the sense of, there are signals that you can read in contemporary culture that portend to certain possibilities. If you think of things like demographics, for example, or any kind of research that people who study contemporary life, like if they're imagining that the world is going to happen in a certain way or speculating about it, then they're doing a form of prediction, right? So while we may not be able to say exactly what the future holds, there's a lot of, I'm going to use your word, Erica, there's a lot of agency along all of those different dimensions to kind of shape things in different ways.
Thank you so much, Devon. Can I just stick with you for just a second? Because I think that is, sorry, that is a great segue for something that when we prepare for this event and we had an email exchange and talked about it, you spoke about kind of bad futures or bad futuring or polarized futures. And I wonder if you want to say a bit more about that against the backdrop of the points you just made. Like what are the different kinds of bad futuring that you see? You
Yeah,
muted.
so
Sorry.
yeah, I knew I was muted. I was sighing. I was taking a deep inhale as I get ready to answer this question. Um, so here's how I would put it. Uh, there, I have done a lot of research with among futurists, uh, and futurist is a big category, but within that category are people who use particular methods to try to understand some of those dimensions that I talked about and set out some likely scenarios for how the future might unfold. And I think that doing that in a responsible and an equitable and an ethical way is actually very important, because you have a lot of those people in those positions have the ear of folks who are in power to make actual decisions about technologies, infrastructures, environment, etc., that then can impact lots of other people, right? So the alternative to that would be a lack of ethical care about the consequences of one's potential actions, or like things that are deeply self-interested. So, for example, like companies that predict certain technological developments that are very self-serving. I'm thinking the first thing that popped into my mind is the metaverse, right? Which you can say the metaverse is here or it's on its way. Are we all going to be living in it? Who knows? But that's what I would consider like a very self-serving prediction. Particularly if you've seen some of the recent just Facebook or Meta company advertising around remote work and things like that in the metaverse, or cryptocurrency, for example. So yeah, that's what I'm talking about, right? To me, it's about it's both a methodological question and kind of an ethical question.
Thanks so much for that. And I also appreciate the bringing in of a recent example from the tech industry here. I think that that's a whole, additional conversation one could have around the role of technology in this futuring and in our presence, and also in what is happening in terms of the fracturing that we're seeing. Mindy, you say that in your bio, it says that you work on identifying social fractures and healing the broken parts. And we've talked about this unprecedented moment of crisis that we're seeing in a planetary moment, and the kind of building up of crisis after crisis after crisis. I wonder if you see any methods for healing the broken parts, not on a global policy level necessarily, but in communities that you are maybe part of, or that you are researching, or that you're working with, that you could share with us. Sorry, Mindy, you're muted.
Thanks. Erica and Devon were both talking about issues of agency and power. And we typically think of agency and power at different levels of scale. So individual agency and power is then located, in the superstructures of the society. So as a social psychiatrist, how I think about these things is that the foundation of society has to do with the bonds, the kind of social bonds that connect us. And so if you have a society, as we do in the United States, where the politicians have long functioned and gained power by separating, by divide and conquer, and then have used that in very explicit and very divisive ways, increasingly over the past 40, 50 years, and have introduced all kinds of political processes, social processes that have broken us, literally broken us apart, so that the bonds that hold society together have been destroyed, then the extent of individual agency is very small, because I have very little agency by myself. I have agency because I'm networked. But if I can't network because all the networks are broken, then I just have my little bit of agency. And about what I can do with my little bit of agency is mindfulness. But what we talk about in social psychiatry is collective efficacy. How does the collective become empowered and act? So in a period of crisis, when there's not collective efficacy, collective power to shape the future, that's what makes this so difficult for people and so frightening for me, looking at it as a social psychiatrist. Like, this is not a good situation to be in. So I think that's an important distinction. So the sort of what we talk about all the time, my colleagues and I, is that these fractured pieces have to be brought back into relationship with each other, because the pieces are not only broken apart, they don't like each other. And you only have to look at 5 minutes of news in America to find a story about how people don't like each other. They're shooting each other. They're, putting nasty signs on each other's walls. It's not a peaceful place. So how do you do that? So my colleagues that I work with in New Jersey at the University of Orange, one of the things that we did was start a project called Music City. A lot of communities in Orange, New Jersey, small American post-industrial city, all of which have great musical talent. Some observers of the music scene in New Jersey have said that Orange has one of the deepest pools of musical talent in the state. And so could we do events that would bring all of that musical talent together? And music is great because it has all the advantages of what we talk about as universal language. So, and people, so, doing that over several years now, you begin to see how, yeah, you can get people of different musical cultures starting to talk to each other, and then that becomes a layer of healing. We're starting a new layer of healing around community gardens. That's a different group of people and different group of networks, but also has the capacity to heal people. The trick here in the United States is you obviously have to bring that to scale. So what does the 30,000 people of Orange, New Jersey have? If you fixed all of Orange, New Jersey, but you didn't fix the United States, we'd still be in bad shape. So communities can be healed, nations can be healed, but one has to say that we're going to do that. And I think that's the point Devon's trying to make, that if people would be responsible about assessing the present and looking at its implications for the future, they would say, we're in very bad shape. Let's put this society back together so that we can handle the future. My bet is that's not what they're going to do, because there's too many people who are in power because of division. As a guy whose father was a very prominent racist politician in this area of New Jersey said, on a video we made, he said, there's a lot of money in racism, and there's a lot of people who do this for money. So that's the trouble that we're in.
Thank you, Mindy. I particularly appreciate that just at the end you brought in, racial capitalism and the idea of, or really the observation that division is something that is literally profited off. Which makes me ask, what are the incentives for healing, as you called it, and healing at scale? And I just want to ask you just for a second, because you spoke about it when you spoke about gardening. I'm very curious to hear about the role of public space you see in that. And I mean physical public space, in cities and in rural communities. And this is, I feel, something we haven't really talked about that much in 2 years. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, because you seem to have, hands-on experience with that.
Well, as you know, I wrote a book called Main Street, How a City's Heart Connects Us All. So public space, Main Street's public space. Main streets are very important. And of course, main streets have functioned very differently during the pandemic. I think because people haven't been outside as much, right? So what role is the public space going to play as we reemerge? And The public space could be, and Main Streets in particular, one of the major vehicles of repair. And so that's the potential. But we get to Devon's point. Are responsible people going to predict the future? What if we don't use the main streets in the way we might? What if we let them fall apart? Our society will fall apart more. What if we don't invest in our parks and make them welcoming to everyone? What if we don't use our streets for music festivals, which is more likely what we will do in the US? So public spaces, I'm all about public space. I'm all about everything we can do in the public space. But getting the society to behave like we actually care about the people, that's the hard part. Keep looking at JoJo drawing. It's almost hypnotic. I don't know if anybody else.
I know. I know it is.
That's Devon. That's Erica.
It is wonderful how it materializes. Thank you for that, Mindy. I appreciate that call for what I hear is also maintenance, not just the design and implementation of new public spaces, but I hear also maintenance and the notion of care, which is something we heard a little bit more about over the past 2 years than public space. I want to take that as a cue for Erica, but before I do that, just a note for the audience. We will have about 5 minutes for maybe a little bit more for Q&A. So if you have a question or a comment, feel free to put that in the Q&A section of the webinar. I already saw a comment and I will pass that on in just a moment. But Erica, for you, you know, kind of coming full circle to the word the shift or shifting, and also agency, which we spoke about a fair bit over the past almost hour. In the past, in situations that are comparable to these, can you share with us whether there were decided shifts that happened, decided collective action, political interventions that were, against the backdrop of pandemics or ecosystems of pandemics, as you just described, that actually created more fruitful environments for communities' maintenance and care, as Minnie just spoke about, or is it a lost cause and has never happened?
So I think there's a kind of complicated answer to this, and in many ways, I hope, because in many ways, look, I feel like I'm echoing some of what Devon and Mindy are really thoughtfully observing. One thing which I think is really interesting is again, we can obviously think about past epidemics and the kind of disruption that they brought into people's lives. So for plague in the early modern period, for the Black Death, these were populations that lost maybe a fifth of their populations, right? Which is a massive number. We are not imagining anything even close to losing a fifth of our population, and outbreaks that were reoccurring sometimes over the course of 20 years. So again, this kind of amazing duration. And obviously historians have talked a lot about in what ways did this reshape labor patterns? Did it reshape the way that political structures functioned? In the 19th century, there were these epidemics of cholera in which the levels of rioting and very physical, causing deaths, attacks on authorities, this complete mistrust of medical authorities and political authorities, which some people talk about, the very dramatic cases in which societies at the time thought that they really were collapsing because that's what they were observing. But what I think is interesting is historians have often pointed out that, of course, all of these things were taking place within a society that was also already undergoing shifts. So the historian Richard Evans, when he talks about these 19th century cholera epidemics in Europe, he talks about how they're like a flash of lightning that reveals social inequalities and reveals the structures of society. And so in some ways, rather than thinking about epidemics as creating these things, a lot of what historians talk about is how they reinforce them, they confirm them, but also therefore society can kind of see how it is structured. And so one of the interesting things to me is often that we want to talk about epidemics as changing society, but a bit, I think, building on what Mindy and Devon are saying, of course, the point is that society isn't just a kind of entity out there, it's us. And so it's actually decision-making that we do where we decide how to respond to these things. And so why I think I can't say this is the end result is not only because I think it makes more sense to think about epidemics as something like a catalyst that might shift movements that are already underway, rather than seeing epidemics as having the agency and the power over us. But I think also because, of course, what this means is in the way that every society is different, you therefore cannot say that there's one way out because societies themselves have different political structures. And so what we see is exactly this notion of the kind of the lightning bolt that's illuminating our values. It's illuminating to us what we think is important, or maybe what we don't think is important, which I think, comes to Mindy's frustrations, I think, in terms of these observations. So that's why I think it's in some ways, I know it's not satisfying to be able to say this is what will result, but in some ways I think it's more fulfilling to point out that there is not an obvious endpoint, precisely because we ourselves are also different and are going to react in these different ways, because it's not, of course, it's not an obvious decision. It is, and I think what I've been really struck by in our conversation with Devon and Mindy is how we're talking about an epidemic as a human phenomenon, right? This is something about humans acting in the world and not simply something acting upon us.
Could I just follow on that, Erica? I know you didn't mean this and your thinking is much more nuanced, but it was a tad dualistic, like epidemics act or we act. And I know that's not what you meant. But epidemics, if you think about half the population dying from the perspective of social psychiatry, the whole world has fallen apart. So if people think the world it has fallen apart if 50% of people die. And as my ecology colleagues always say, there's other germs in the woods that do cause 50% mortality could come at, waiting to come for us. My point is that it's not simply a lightning bolt. It's a lightning bolt, not only of what we were, but of what, there's also of what happened. An epidemic, why do we care about epidemics? Because we can't function when all the people are sick or dying. It's a real thing. So it's a, when you think about like what the crack epidemic did in African-American neighborhoods in the 80s and 90s, it completely reorganized their lives, completely. So there was a before and there was a during and there was an after, but the weight of it, the force, it's a tsunami. An epidemic is a tsunami, and so that's a real thing. So a lightning bolt, in the sense that, oh, and this is how we reacted to it, is it's not, I'm not saying it's not a useful metaphor, but if you aren't also saying, look, it's a tsunami and it's a lightning bolt, that's all I want to say.
I actually think we agree, partly because I think I agree with you that you can't make sense of an epidemic without understanding how it's acting on people's social circumstances. And I guess part of what it comes from what I think about when we talk about global health. For example, a lot of people have said that cholera causes us to come up with infrastructure. And of course, what's interesting is there are cholera outbreaks all the time in the world. And of course, they don't lead us to solve those problems necessarily. In fact, we can have pharmaceutical interventions, and rather than tackling the social problems that are underlying those issues. So I think we actually agree in the sense that these are tremendous problems. I think what they have us think about is, are they just a biological problem, or are they something that actually gets us to think about how there's these underlying social conditions? And of course, like we were talking about with AIDS, right? You can only really make sense of the patterns of this disease if you also take into account violence, the economic inequalities, the way that societies, cities especially, are structured, because that is actually how we see the patterns of disease spreading. So I agree with you actually that, in some ways, this is when we become alert to the problems, but I think there's always still this debate. What are those problems, and then who's going to solve them? Will we just think that having a vaccine, for example, will solve all the inequalities that now have been laid bare? I suppose is another way of thinking about it.
If I could add
Thank you
just
for
one
that.
thing that I was thinking about here, is that I think there's also an interpretive aspect to what both of you were talking about, right? So it's the thing that happens, and then there's the social response to the thing that happens, and then there's the interpretation. And obviously, those things are layered and interspliced and, and all of that as well, right? And so, like, what it's like, yeah, you have to, like, and all of that is recursive, right? And all of that is feeding into each other as well. So I just think that's an important kind of thing to think about here.
Thank you all for this conversation, and Devon for bringing it kind of full circle now again with the notion of recursiveness, which I really appreciate. And I am going to take the last couple of minutes to turn to the audience. We have a few questions, and Devon, I'm actually going to stay with you for just a moment. And Chris Bentley has a question, and they say fiction focusing on a post-pandemic future is becoming a big genre. How does this form of speculation help or damage our society moving forward in time? And then if the other two panelists want to respond to that as well, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, I guess I would say that science fiction has, for a century, right, has been a really useful genre that helps people to think about the future in different ways. And science fiction has also been prescriptive. And by that, I mean it gives people actual ideas. There are still people in like the technology space who are trying to create a replicator because they watched Star Trek when they were kids, right? So I think that these new forms of speculative fiction are very useful because I think that it makes some of the challenges and the crises that we face tangible for people in a way that allows them to see what life would actually be like, because some of these changes are, they feel very abstract. And they're hard, even as you start to see, weather emergencies and what have you happening around you. It can be very hard to conceptualize what that actually might look like. So I think that they can be really, really helpful. They could also potentially be damaging, depending again on what kind of ideas they seed and who takes control of those ideas and how that exacerbates some of the problems that exist. But that's a very quick answer to that question.
Thank you very much. If Mindy and Erica, you don't mind, I would kind of swiftly want to move on to another question that we actually got, if that's okay. And this question is from AJ Revels for you, Mindy, and they're asking Dr. Fullilove, outside of colonial societies like America, Canada, Australia, etc., which cultures do you see have enough healthy social practices and bonds that could serve as a foundation for their survival and restoration?
Well, we live in a globalized system of, and imperialism, and the penetration of the market is worldwide. So, to say who's healthy is nobody's outside of that system and its implications. But one might use the shorthand of how did each of these societies handle COVID? So, how did Vietnam really did a lot of great things around COVID. So did South Korea. So an interesting group of societies had respectful, public health oriented, people focused responses to COVID, and those are societies worth talking to about how are they organized, what are they thinking about, and how did they get there. But imperialism is a huge force. So to think there's, to say, well, don't talk about colonial societies, like, yeah, but it's all imperialism. So how do you can't discount that.
Thank you, Mindy. I would actually, Erica, invite you to add to that as well, not least given that you are currently located across the pond in Oxford.
Look, I think it's a really fascinating question about how our global scope to thinking about responses. And again, if there's a way, I definitely cannot necessarily predict or kind of point to an obvious example, because I think in some ways we're still in the midst of a crisis, right? It's very hard to see what's going on. But I think this notion of thinking beyond our own immediate experience, and obviously I think this has been part of the process of a pandemic, right? To think about what is a global phenomenon. And obviously, as in many ways we've been saying, within one society, it's been very different. Across the world, it's been very different. But I do think it's an interesting point to think through just how different these geographic landscapes have been, but the varieties of cultural responses, and how in many ways, I think for years now, we'll still be navigating how we evaluate these different responses. I'm very hesitant to think about an example. And one of the things I've been really struck by, how is in some ways, of course, we have a tendency to retreat into our national boundaries and our differences. And some of the categories we've used throughout have been this kind of, who's doing better, compare this country with that country. But of course, those are in many ways arbitrary categories. And that's something which I found very striking. That's something people did in the 18th centuries. They tried to compare countries according to these very crude levels. And so again, I do think part of the ending process will be us rethinking what it means to be an international community, and to maybe be redefining notions of global health and international medicine, something that we've been trying to do for ages, but I hope that we won't give up on.
Thank you, Erica. And I think that is a really great note to end on, and return to the question, shifting forward, question mark, and hold on to that and ask, how can we think about global public health as we inevitably move forward? It is 3 minutes after 5 here in New York City on a Friday afternoon. And so I want to wrap this here and really sincerely thank our terrific panelists, Dr. Devon Powers, Dr. Erica Charters, and Dr. Mindy Fullilove. You can find them and their amazing work online. If you have more questions, you can also find their contact details online. And I also want to thank Jojo Carlin, who has just, is showing us the full conversation. Thank you so much today. In under an hour, it's amazing. Thank you so much, Jojo. I really appreciate you and your terrific work. Also, sincere appreciation to Sam and Zari for facilitating on the back end, and of course to our terrific audience. Thank you for joining us today. This event has been recorded. It is live on Twitter now. It will stay there. It will also go up on the IPK YouTube channel. And as an educator, I always say at this point, this makes great teaching material. If you're a professor or a teacher, you can use these videos in your classroom. And on that note, everybody have a wonderful Friday evening or night, Erica. Take good care of yourselves and your communities. And I hope to see you all very soon. Thank you so much and take care. Happy weekend.